Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us Chesa Boudin, who has written a book on Latin America and has been following Latin American politics. Chesa, good to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We have recently a coup, which is still not clear whether it's a coup or not a coup, attempted coup in Ecuador. And it seems to be that the Honduras coup effect is now being felt in other parts of Latin America. So do you think this is the Honduras effect? Do you think it was not a coup? How would you really look at it?
I think it's different from Honduras, but obviously there's a troublesome trend of populist left-leaning leaders being under attack. In the case of Honduras, President Zelaya was overthrown and the coup was successful. And in the case of Ecuador, it's still debated, as you say. Was it a coup or was it just a labor protest, as some people have framed the issue? I don't know what has happened. And people I speak with in Ecuador, my friends on the ground, also don't know whether to call it a coup or not to call it a coup. There was a survey released this week, however, that indicates that 3/4 of the people in Ecuador think it was an attempt to overthrow the government. Whether or not we want to call that a coup with all of its implications is perhaps a separate question. But it is clear, I think, as the majority of Ecuadorians now indicate, that there was a clear attempt to overthrow the government of President Rafael Correa.
I would tend to think that if the president is tear gassed by the police, driven into a hospital, or not allowed to come out,
yes.
Held hostage,
Yeah.
the airport has been taken over, all this in any other country would be called a coup. But yes, I do understand that particularly some of the trade union groups and the indigenous groups have not called it a coup. In fact, they have said it was a civil disturbance, it was not handled well, but by all appearances, it would appear that anywhere else in the world, it would have been called a coup.
I think that's absolutely right. One of the complications in Ecuador, and I think one of the things that makes it such a fascinating country politically, both historically and today in the context of this attempt of overthrowing the government, is that the indigenous movements are tremendously powerful. Ecuador is one of only a few countries in Latin America where the majority of the population identifies as indigenous, still today. And they have tremendous political power, and they've been instrumental in overthrowing previous presidents that have betrayed them and gone back on campaign promises. In this case, the various indigenous movements that unify all the different indigenous groups in Ecuador have been initially very supportive of President Correa in his election campaign. And since then, they've been critical of him, but critically supportive for the most part. And so I think one of the problems and one of the reasons that people get so caught up on the semantics of whether or not this was or was not a coup is because the indigenous movements have lately been very critical of him. And they've worked in some capacity with international donors, including the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a US government-funded organization. That has led some critics from the left to say that these indigenous groups are working with imperialism or working with the CIA to overthrow the government. And I think many of the spokespeople for these groups in Ecuador, CONAI and some of the other indigenous groups, have said that's not the case at all. We support democracy, we supported President Correa in his election, we oppose an attempt to overthrow him undemocratically, but we have valid criticisms. And I think the challenge for people outside of Ecuador, observers, is to recognize the legitimacy of internal criticism and debate without validating the attempt to undo and overthrow a democratically elected left-leaning president.
I think that's an interesting point that comes up, that in fact CONAI has been critical of Correa recently, also because of the change of policies regarding mining and other interests, that effectively there is an attempt to use the mining interests, giving it to imperialist forces, capitalist forces, if you will, but using that to get Ecuador out of the crisis. So that is at the expense of the indigenous movement. So that is not surprising that there would be dissonance over there.
Yes, and I think the key point, you're exactly right. The Correa administration has largely continued the extractive economic policies of his predecessors, and that has been felt in very negative ways by the indigenous communities across the country. The Amazon basin is filled with indigenous groups that are sitting on top of oil, and when you continue pumping that oil to pay for government operations, it destroys their land, their history, their communities, their culture. So those are real problems for the indigenous people that have, I think, rightly led them to be critical of the Correa government. But the contradiction in what often is heard, I think, sometimes from the far left in this situation is that because Correa has continued these policies, the U.S. doesn't necessarily want to overthrow him. If he had lived up to his campaign promises, if the indigenous movement were fully behind him for protecting their communities and their way of life, then perhaps it would be believable that the CIA were trying to overthrow him. But given his commitment to extractive economic policies, the U.S. government doesn't like him. They wish they still had their military bases in Manta. They wish they were still, a full partner in the drug war and so on. But all things considered, the economy is churning forward. So I think that's one of the points of tension that is often lost in the reductionist analysis that comes out, I think.
But if you really look at the other way, apart from the extractive policies, Korea has also not gone forward on land reforms, which would be the other issue for them. But given that aside, taking that aside, U.S. has the issue of ALBA, it has the issue of Venezuela, and anybody who aligns with Venezuela today, in their books, extractive policies or no, would be somebody who would be a candidate for removal.
Correct.
I would tend to think that the politics in this case would trump the economics.
It could be, but I think this is one of the great accomplishments of President Chavez. Love him or hate him, as people on the left and the right do. I think he's been extremely successful at creating political space for other Latin American countries and other Latin American social movements to elect left-leaning leaders. So I think take somebody like Correa or Morales, 20 years ago, they would have been intolerable to Washington. But today, because Chavez is so outspoken in his criticism, is so well financed by the oil boom, and so capable of supporting revolutionary projects in his own country and further afield, that I think he's really distracted Washington from other leaders. Lula is now seen as a close ally of Washington, despite the fact that he is quite progressive compared to presidents in Brazil historically.
If you really look at it, if Chavez was not there, that Lula would have been called left-leaning in...
a communist he would have been in years past. They would have...
the
red square, exactly, exactly.
So it is the politics in Latin America is a little more complex than just reducing to extractive politics or not in that sense. But do you think this is a warning for President Correa to rethink on some of these policies, his relations with the trade unions, his relations with the indigenous movements? Or do you think that he will take this as a signal to go forward and come what may, that this is now that he's sort of crushed the coup, that he's really going to go forward with his policies?
Well, I'm optimistic and hopeful that he will take it as a clarion call to go back to his roots in the mass movements that elected him, to the people at the base of Ecuadorian society who made it possible for someone like him to be elected in the first place. Hopefully that will be the case. I'm worried, though, and this is again where the issue of semantics comes into play. I'm concerned that the government's determination to call this a coup and to attempt to highlight supposed U.S. involvement in the effort is perhaps an attempt to do the opposite and to say, see, we've survived this, there's an evil boogeyman out there, there are no real problems here in our house, the problems are out there. And I think that's the risk of highlighting. There may have been U.S. involvement, I don't know. But there are still very real problems domestically. The government has failed on a number of levels, as you've highlighted, land reform, extractive economic policies, and more, to live up to the promises it made to the indigenous movement and the broader, the working class in Ecuador.
Well, it's obvious that the United States would welcome if President Correa is thrown out and somebody else comes in who's
his
more
opponent,
right.
Noboa, for example, who ran against him, would be welcome.
Much more welcome.
Yes.
At the same time, would they really burn all their bridges on this? Probably no. So that's what they really have also shown. But given all that, the real issue is today is also that, for the left, in across Latin America, there is this dissonance between what is called the statist left and the left from below.
Yes.
And unless these two pull together, I don't think they're in a position to really neutralize what the United States would like to do in Latin America.
It's a very difficult thing, and it's one of the issues that living in Latin America for many years, as I've done, was most fascinating to me. Watching what I perceive to be a dialectic between state power and popular power. In Ecuador, you see it. In Venezuela, you see it. For example, many people criticize President Chavez on the left and the right for being so state-centric, for consolidating power within his own hands and within the Venezuelan government. However, often that power, that consolidation of power, is used to empower social groups at the base, the mass movements, to get past the bureaucracy and the corruption and the incompetence in government and in existing state structures, and to create new ones at the grassroots, the communal councils, other distributive mechanisms. So I think there's a real tension between the valid and righteous criticisms of this concentration of state power on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ways that state power can be used very effectively and very efficiently to fulfill promises to a population base that is in desperate need of concrete change.
Also, if you look at the global scenario today, if you want to oppose the imperial power of the United States, it's difficult to conceive of it without some of the states actually coming in support of popular movements. And I don't think popular movements by themselves today have the strength to take on, in Latin America, for example, the United States imperial power, plus their own elite, which still holds a considerable part of even the Venezuelan economy.
Absolutely. Tremendously powerful local elites in Latin America continue to repress alternative voices in the media. You have issues of access to media space in Venezuela to this day, despite tremendous government involvement in the media sector. And I think you're also right that this issue of mutual dependence between the base that elects these leaders and the leaders that in turn depend on the base not only for election but then in the case of Ecuador recently, or in Venezuela in 2002, when there is an attempt to overthrow that government, it requires the people coming out and taking the streets and demanding the continuity of their democratic process. And so I think that relationship is key to any effort to resist imperialism.
And it does seem to have been damaged in this coup, particularly, as I was saying, as you were also saying, the CONAI and even the trade unions not really coming out in support or coming out against the coup. In fact, they were very lukewarm, even in criticizing the coup, calling it really a labor problem.
Right, and a lot of internal debate before they made any official announcements at all, showing a real division about how to react.
And the demonizing by, again, a certain section of the left of these forces who have a legitimate criticism and therefore were ambivalent on
Right.
President Correa
Right.
isn't helping the matters
It's
in
not
any
helping.
case.
But the good thing, and what I try to take solace in, what I see reason for optimism in the recent Ecuador situation, is that there were mass protests against this effort. That, yes, perhaps the left is fractured in Ecuador as it is all over the world, but nonetheless, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in Quito and around the country to say this is not acceptable. We demand that our president, we elected, problems or no, be allowed to finish his term. And I think if it weren't for that popular movement, if it weren't for that outpouring of support for democracy and for this particular administration, then it may be that Correa would have been killed or deposed the way that happened in Honduras. So I think that you see, again, this mutual dependence of the state on the people and the people on these newly elected left-wing governments.
Thank you. I think this has been a very interesting discussion, and Latin America continues perhaps to be the most interesting place in the world today, particularly for the left.
Yes, I think it's a source of tremendous optimism for us all, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to discuss it with you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.